right up front, this is a, oh, there's Stan. Looks like you're able to.
My wife's working on another computer.
Oh, okay. But so we so much appreciate your patience. I know that everyone is, is anxious to get going on this. And so while it's not ideal that we're virtual for our first meeting, I'm so glad that so many of you could join us. And thank everybody for taking so much time with us through the month of May as we met with everyone individually. And we sent out the materials last week. So hopefully you've had a chance to read them, and we'll be working with some of those materials in the meeting today. So with that, we've got just a few protocol pieces to work through before we actually dive into the agenda. It looks like Stan's got his tech support there, in-house tech support.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay. And so I know, so there, okay. So we'll put the agenda up on the screen in just a moment here. Thank you, Sam. So just a couple of logistics. We're scheduled to be together in this virtual meeting today for 2 hours, so until 4 o'clock. And again, this is the kickoff meeting for the Beaver Management Work Group. So it looks like everybody's in the right place. Sam, you want to go to the next slide? So even though we have all become quite proficient at Zoom, it's always worthwhile to make sure we're working from the same foundation. So we have a few tips, and inevitably what we found is somebody learns something new when we show these slides. We want to make sure people can fully participate to the best that they can. So it looks like everyone's connected by audio and people are muted. So already we've got good protocols going. Sam and I are co-hosts, so we can mute you and unmute you if you are having any trouble. We have one caller, and that's Wayne Elmore. And we've worked with Wayne to try to connect him up with the video, but he's just going to join us by phone today. And so we've worked out a system with Wayne about how we can have him join the conversation at key points. And we really ask, especially since this is our first meeting, if people can be on the screen on their video as much as possible. We totally understand, if you've got to take a break to see somebody at your door, or your dog's barking and you need to go take care of them, or you need to eat a sandwich. I mean, we totally get if you need to go off screen for those kinds of things. But really, by and large, if folks can stay on the screen, that would be really great. So Sam, you want to go ahead and then actually before Sam leaves, you can see Sam's phone number there. You can call her with technical difficulties. Certainly you can chat her, and you have her email, and you can email, and she will do everything she can to help you. So Sam, you want to go ahead and go to the next one? So a couple other things. We're going to use the raise hand function the best we can. If we all stay on screen, you can actually just raise your hand, which is a novel thing, but Sam and I will keep track of either virtual little blue hands that are raised, or your own hands. And I think we've asked everyone to make sure their first names are on the screen. And if you haven't done that already, it would be good to rename yourself to make sure that you can. You can chat. The chat function is available for everybody, and you can certainly, chat questions to us, or so Sam, you're saying no?
Oh no, you can chat.
Oh, okay. You shook your head like this, and I was like, what?
Sorry.
Wait, no. So you can use the chat function to build on what somebody else has said. What we ask you not to do is have parallel meetings in the chat, and I think you've probably seen that before, where a whole nother line of conversation is going on in the chat. And the two things happen with that. One is we treat it just like if you're having a side conversation at the table. Even though we can't hear you, it is disruptive to the flow. And it means that you're not paying attention to what the full group is doing. So we ask you to not, have a full-blown conversation in the chat, but do use the chat to let us know, you want to speak, build on something somebody said, pose a question. All those are really, really good uses for the chat. Sam, is there anything else I'm forgetting about this slide?
Just if you do for some reason have to join by phone, or if you are connected by phone, it's *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute yourself. That's the other thing to remember here.
Okay. And Sam, there's a Sharon in the waiting room.
Yeah, there's a Sharon Coos Curry, and I don't see that name on the roster. And so I feel like I will message that person
Okay,
afterwards.
great.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So I mentioned about renaming yourself. It's really helpful. There's a lot of us. We're all meeting each other, some of us for the first time. It'd be really great if you could make sure that your name appears on the screen. So it makes just so much easier when we're addressing each other. And it looks like everybody has done that. Yeah, it looks like everybody has done that. So really appreciate that. Next slide. So the different views, this is just a reminder of, you can have a speaker view, you can have a gallery view. It'd be great if you can keep it on gallery view. And then just what that means is you can use the center bar. Is that on the next slide, Sam? About the center bar?
Yeah, it's just the same slide
Yep.
here.
Yeah. So the center bar, if you're not familiar with it, you can click on it and move it to the left or the right and make your screen larger or smaller. So you can see smaller presentation, more people, or bigger presentation, less people. Next slide. Okay. Whew. We promise not to go through all those protocols every time, but it is a good reminder. And everyone's has had a different level of experience working with in this virtual environment. So we think it's a good idea to put those out there. So welcome, agenda review and introductions. Let me go through and do the introduction or the agenda review. And then I'm going to turn it over to our commissioners. We have Commissioners Hyde, Zarnowitz, and Woolley, and I'd like for them to make any welcoming comments. And then we're going to move into introductions of all of you. So that's what we're doing for that piece. Then we're going to talk about the convening interview summary just a little bit. Talk about some key themes. I have a couple questions for all of you about, things that did you learn something new, or there's some surprises, some things that we need to talk through. We have an exercise that I don't know if people are familiar with Jamboard. It's a Google Jamboard, and it's an interactive way for us to do some prioritization around key issues. And it's very, very easy. So the only person who I think probably won't be able to participate fully is Wayne, but I have a way to loop Wayne in. And so we've got a little mini tutorial about it, and then we're going to do an exercise around the key questions that were identified through the convening interviews to begin to prioritize those and have some discussion about those. That will really help us figure out, moving forward, how to start landing some presentations and some bringing forward more information for all of you in future meetings. So that's an exercise we're going to do. And then we're going to have some conversation about the charter, which we sent out in advance, which was built from the interviews that everybody had, and see if we can have discussion and finalize that. And if not, we can carry that over to the next meeting. We have a little scheduled graphic to put up that you saw in the charter, and we just want to go over that briefly. Particularly, we're hoping to land the next meeting of this group. And we asked everybody to redo the doodle poll because we were not coming up with dates, which is not surprising over the summer. People are busy, but we don't want to let too much time go by before we get together again. And then we'll confirm next steps, the next meeting, and then we'll be done at 4. So we've got some times on there that are more than illustrative, but less than hard and directive. So we'll be a little bit flexible based on the conversation we have. So with that, I want to turn it over to our 3 commissioners who are here, just to, the 30-second welcome from each of you, maybe a minute, but just for each of you to just welcome the group and anything that you'd like to share with them about all of them working with us today and in the future. So who'd like to go first?
I'll go. I thought you might call us out by name. Anyway, that's fine. So anyway, I'm really happy that we finally got this going, and I just want to welcome everybody. I initially contacted, I think, every one of you individually to get your interest level and describe the time commitment, and I really appreciate our facilitator staff to all the follow-up that they've done. So anyway, I just want to say thanks, and it's a big time commitment, and it means that you're all really passionate about this topic. And again, thanks for your patience. I think we started working on this at the end of last summer. I think the initial question came up to the commission. So thanks again, and I look forward to going through the process with you.
Thanks. Who would like to go next? Jill?
I'll go next. It's Becky's just sitting there smiling. Yeah, I'm Jill Zarnowitz. I am a commissioner for District 1 of Oregon, and I'm sitting in and as a alternate in case Greg Woolley is not here forever, Commissioner Woolley. And then I'll help out as much as I can.
Great, thanks, Jill. Becky?
Okay, I am just want to weigh in and say that I'm really thankful for each and every person that has showed up to this today. I think we have an incredible opportunity here to build new relationships and learn important things about beavers and one another. And I am thankful for all of you taking your time, because I'm sure there's other things you could be doing with your time. And so I really appreciate you all being here.
Great, thank you. And then Sam and I have met everybody on the call, so we won't spend any more time with our introductions. But Sam, there was one other slide we wanted to do before we did everybody else's introductions, right? Can you go ahead and put that back up? So we've got some meeting guidelines. These are in the charter. This is a mix of sort of best practices around meeting guidelines, as well as ones that were recommended in the charter when we asked people about meeting guidelines. So we ask that folks fully participate in the work group meetings to the extent that you can. Come prepared for meetings. We have committed to send materials out a week in advance. We'll follow up with a meeting summary a week after this meeting. And there may be materials we send out in the interim in between meetings. We'll ask that folks participate in an open and mutually respectful way. Doesn't mean you have to agree. We just ask that people listen with an open mind and speak in a respectful tone. Balance of speaking time. So there's a lot of us, and there's a wide range of experience that people have with this topic. And so, it would be very easy for folks to, go off and really share all of their experience and expertise. We ask that you be mindful of how much you're talking, and also be mindful of if you're not speaking, because there's a lot of folks that are just really comfortable being listeners, and that's great. But we would like everyone to be able to hear everybody's voice. And we'll be watching that too, and we'll be providing opportunities to make sure that at least in every meeting, everybody gets to say, something. And then, so be mindful of your own speaking, either too much or not enough. And you can certainly invite other people to speak as well. I don't have to do all the heavy lifting. So you can encourage and ask questions of each other. You're all here representing a larger community of interest, and you're serving as a liaison in a lot of ways to that. And we will benefit from the experience that you bring from that larger community. And so we would ask that you bring information back to that community and bring their thoughts, concerns, questions back to us. And so we would hope that you will continue to serve in that liaison capacity. And then finally, just act in good faith. I think that we're all here in good faith to try to see what we can work out together and what we can develop together in terms of some recommendations that we can support as a collective for the commission to consider. And I think everyone's going to be working hard to try to make that happen. And so we just ask that people act in good faith. What's the next slide, Sam? Is that the introductions question? Nope. Go ahead and take that down. Great. So for introductions, and things have already taken a little bit longer than we expected, but it's not surprising. We would like to hear from everybody, and you already had practice at this with the interview summaries. And one of the first questions we asked all of you after who you are and what your affiliation is and where you're from is we asked you to answer the question or complete the sentence at the end of this process. I hope that in just a very succinct way. And if you look at I think it's the second page of the convening interview summary, there's a whole list not attributed to anybody of all those hopes of people of what you'd like to see out of this. So what we'd like to do is begin to attribute those to you. And so everybody can hear kind of where folks are at. And so we'd like you to say your name and your affiliation. You don't have to say where you're from yet, because we're going to do that in a minute. And then complete the sentence at the end of this process, I hope that, and try to keep it succinct, just a sentence, a few words, or even look at the notes on the page to refresh your memory about what you said. And then we'll go through and hear from everybody. And it'll probably take us about, 10, 15 minutes tops to do that, I would think. If people can be, just a few words or a sentence. So if people are game for that, we're going to wake you up, and I'm going to start with, I'll ask our commissioners again to start, and then we'll have them. I'll start with Becky, and then Becky will go to Greg, and Greg will go to Jill, and then Jill's just going to pick somebody to go next, and then the next person will pick somebody to go next until we get through everybody. And Sam's going to keep track to make sure that who's gone and who hasn't gone. Okay? So Becky, you're up.
That is just crazy.
Name,
No.
affiliation.
I thought, okay, I'll have some time. At the end At the end of this process, I hope we build better relationships with one another in Oregon so that we can do really wonderful things for fish, wildlife, and communities together. And that not only will it be good for beavers in Oregon, but it will be good for other critters and humans in Oregon in the future. So there you go.
Great. Now kick it over to Greg.
Greg, hit you.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. And I echo some of what Commissioner Hatfield had said. These are groups that have not traditionally worked side by side together, even though some of that has been happening. And that's really exciting. And so my vision is really that all organizations that care about fish and wildlife have an equal seat at the table, an equal voice, and are equally considered in terms of their views and perspectives and what they care about. And just a really quick thing, which I didn't see I know we're going to go over the charter, and maybe I'll save my comment for that, but at that point, I guess I want to remind people of why this committee initially was pulled together in the first place. But anyway, I'll save that.
Yeah.
So thank you. And Commissioner Zarnowitz, would you like to go next?
Sure. Yes, I echo Becky that I hope we could learn from each other. And I think at the end of this, I hope that there's some, I guess, reaching a conclusion where we can find ways to incorporate beaver management into creating environment as well as providing for other needs that people have for beavers, whether it's trapping or protecting their land. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And I'm going to call on Scott Beckstead.
And remember, Scott, your name and affiliation, and then complete the sentence.
Sure. Thank you very much. Very happy to be here with all of you. My name is Scott Beckstead, sitting here at my home in Sutherland, Oregon, which is in North Douglas County. I am the Director of Campaigns for the Center for a Humane Economy and Animal Wellness Action, two affiliated organizations. I started with these organizations about 6 months ago. Before that, I was with the Humane Society of the United States for about 12 and a half years. I also am an adjunct law professor at Willamette University, where I teach animal law, wildlife law and policy, Endangered Species Act, and cannabis law. So I hope, what I would like to see, I happen to see a family of beavers every single morning when I take my dogs out for a walk around this lake. So I've become very, very fond of these little critters, but I'm also very aware of how important they are to ecosystems. So what I would like to see happen is that beavers are given more protection under the law in Oregon in a way that recognizes the ecosystem services that they provide, especially on public lands. So, and I will pick on my old buddy / nemesis, Stan Steele. Stan and I go way back. We always joke that we've been slugging it out with each other for so long that I could probably give his presentation and he could give mine. But Stan, it's really great to see you, and I'll let you go next.
You're muted, Stan. Stan, could you unmute? Or could you unmute? Stan?
Yeah, so if you just click on the little red microphone at the bottom of your screen. It's red and it has a little slash through it.
Can you not unmute him, Sam?
No, I can only ask to unmute him, but he has to accept.
There he
Is it
is.
there?
Yep. Great.
Okay, Scott, thanks for the kind intro. Scott and I have been at the opposite end of spectrums many, many times, but there's been a great mutual respect. I actually like him. Let's put it this way. I'd drink a beer with him anytime and go fishing anytime. So that's what I do hope comes out of this. I'm a 25-year retired Oregon State Police Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Trooper. I also call myself as a hunter, fisher, trapper, as a wildlife management practitioner. And I think that's a great term. We're actually involved in the activities that actually are supporting basically the funding of ODFW. I represent as a member of the U.S. Sportsmen's Alliance, National Trappers Association, Fur Takers of America, Oregon Trappers Association, Oregon United Sporting Dogs Association, and Hunting Works for Oregon. And we're all conservation organizations. What I want to see come out of this is good policy discussion and development if identified as a need. Scott, I love beaver too. And I would point to Amy Patrick of OHA.
Hi, Amy Patrick of OHA. I am Amy Patrick, and I'm the outreach coordinator for OHA. And at the end of this process, I really hope that we can perhaps find some really great scientific research that we could come together as a group to facilitate. As far as data on beavers and where we need to go with beaver management, I think first we need to really anchor into some really sound science. And I think that would be an exciting thing for this group to undertake. As Commissioner Woolley said, a lot of times our groups aren't always, flying our flags on the same pole, so to speak. And this would be kind of a neat opportunity for us to come behind some research opportunities that could really inform where we go from here. So I appreciate everybody being on here. And I'm going to call on Michael O'Casey.
Thanks, Amy. I'm Michael O'Casey, and I'm the Conservation Chair for the Oregon chapter of the Wildlife Society. And I'm filling in for Leland Brown today as the alternate since he's traveling around the Northeast states working on non-lead partnership issues. And as part of the Wildlife Society, I kind of echo what Amy has to say, is that I think there's some great opportunities with this group to find some balance and to find some opportunities on a species that frankly are prevalent, but not very well understood in the state of Oregon. And I think, that science and understanding the science can really lead to some sound policy. And I want to make sure it's backed in that. And so the Wildlife Society looks forward to participating in this process and calling on our 800 some members and scientists around the state who work on this closely and find some good common ground solutions. And I will call on somebody I have not met yet. Let's go with Lauren Smith.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren. I am the Natural Resources Legislative Policy Manager at Association of Oregon Counties. And I guess what I would like to see is I echo what Michael and Amy shared about the science and the data, but also for a better understanding, I think, of the cost to local governments to protect our taxpayer infrastructure when it comes to beaver management, and that there is a cost there for our local government and our taxpayers. And I pick Mary Ann because she's easy to pick on.
Hi, everyone. I am Mary Ann Cooper with the Oregon Farm Bureau. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy for the Farm Bureau. And I think at the end of this process, I am hoping, as others said, for a better understanding of the science. Quite frankly, the charter was a little different than what I understood our scope to be. So a better understanding of the scope and the problem we're trying to solve. And also hopefully some real earnest desire to actually work with landowners as opposed to telling landowners what to do when it comes to beaver management and predator management more broadly. So I will call on Brian because I don't think he's been called on yet.
Thanks, Mary Ann. Hi, everybody. I am Brian Posowitz, and I am participating on behalf of Humane Voters Oregon. We are an animal welfare organization. At the end of the process, I'm hopeful that we can come up with some mutually agreed upon ways to better protect beavers in Oregon and treat them more humanely, both for the sake of the beavers themselves, as well as for the sake of all the benefits they provide to other fish and wildlife and watersheds, or that if not, that we can at least come up with some processes or procedures to come up with such solutions. And I will call on, assuming we want to bring the agency folks into this, I'll call on Tom Stahl from ODFW.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tom Stahl. I am with ODFW. I am on the I'm within Fish Division in the agency, and I'm the Conservation Recovery Program Manager. At the end of this process, I would like us to all have had a good discussion and hopefully come to as much common understanding as we can over all of the complexities around beaver, their biology, their ecology, the role they play in the ecosystem, their interactions with humans, and get an idea in terms of some of the information that we might lack to make management decisions around them so we can better improve the amount of beaver-related habitat out there that benefits multiple species. So with that, I will call on Danielle Mosier.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Moser. I'm the Wildlife Program Coordinator for Oregon Wild. At the end of this, I hope to have very specific enforceable language and policy recommendations to go to the Commission for adoption into rule. Thanks. And I will call on Boone Kaufman.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm so delighted to be here. My name is Boone Kaufman. I'm a semi-retired professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. I am a wetlands and riparian ecologist, having conducted research throughout the state of Oregon over the past 30 years or so. I'm also on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, focusing largely or contributing largely on the role that wetlands and riparian zones play towards climate change mitigation and adaptation throughout the world, including the incredible role that beavers play in climate change mitigation and adaptation. And I guess I would like to see similar focus to what everybody else says is like science about beavers is pretty clear. And it would be nice to see our management starting to reflect that science, recognition of terms such as keystone species concepts, as opposed to terms developed in the 30s, such as predator and varmint or pest species. With that, thank you very much. And I will, I'll call on my old student, Kevin Blakely, to speak up next. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Boone. Your star student will take it on here. I'm Kevin Blakely. I'm the Deputy Administrator in the Wildlife Division. I'm actually sitting on the group as an alternate for Shannon with busy schedules. My opportunity or my kind of outcomes I'm looking for is really a launching point for some strategic directions in regards to some opportunities that are acceptable to everyone that's involved in the work group. And I will pass it along to the next person I see in alphabetical order here. Let's see, that's Matt Strickland. They're on my screen.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt Strickland with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I work for the Aquatic Inventories program. We do stream habitat surveys and fish assessments throughout the state of Oregon. And at the end of this, I am hopeful that my program can have a better idea of how we can monitor and describe beaver abundance and habitat throughout the state of Oregon. And I will call on Darren Bolin. Is he gone yet?
Darren, you're still on mute. Are you able to unmute yourself there?
There he goes.
Sorry about that. I couldn't hear. Can you guys hear me? I'm having a bad connection, I think, over here.
Yep, you sound all right. A little bit cheap, a little choppy,
Yeah,
but
it's a
you're
bad
okay.
connection. But hopefully you can hear me. My name is Darren Bolin. I work for Bureau of Land Management out of the Cascades office. And we've been starting the last couple of years, I've been starting using Beaver for projects up in the Cascades to manage lands and some meadows and stuff that we put some beaver dam analogs in and want to get beavers back up in there to let them take care of those beaver dam analogs. And what I'm hoping to get out of this meeting is a science-based decisions, and everybody else took pretty much all of the other answers to that. So I'm going to go science-based decisions, and then hopefully we can get everybody to get on board with the same page and everything. So thank you.
Who are you going to call on, Darren?
I'll call on Michelle Tate, I guess.
I'm Michelle Tate with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the executive support staff for the commissioners. And I hope that we come out of this today with, or with the end of the meeting, with the respect of each other's differences and being able to find those common grounds. It's something really valuable that we can really use more of in the agency with our partners.
Who are you going to call, Michelle?
Let's see. Wayne Elmore hasn't spoke yet.
Right. Hey, Wayne, you remember what to do? Star 6, right, Sam?
Yes, star 6.
So Wayne, press star 6 on your phone, and then you can. There you are. Perfect.
Did that work?
You did.
Okay. My name is Wayne Elmore, and I came to this part of the country in it's about 1917, or no, I can't even remember when I started. But I've been here a long time, and my big focus is on water and what we have done to the underground water. And for instance, like sandy, silty clays. Most of the time, we see those as 10 pounds or so that the stream is holding, whereas in aerated soils, we can get up to 60 pounds of water. And the tie there is, I guess, how should I say this? The tie is we're not looking at the plants that are on the banks that have the deep roots that also break that up and give us a lot more water storage. And just having beaver and and having them in some of the systems, we don't really look at what kind of plants we've got that should be going underneath those same soils. And so that's been my kind of like my focus for the last 50 years that I've been here. So.
And so Wayne, so at the end of this, process, you hope what?
Well,
how would...
I hope we start looking at what plants go with what ecosystems and what stream systems, because a lot of the creeks that we've got, like over here in Prineville, we have very few of the native stream system plants that we used to have here a couple of 100 years ago. And our streams are straight as a string, and we have just screwed everything up so that just putting beaver dams in and having beavers and not looking at all the other parts that go to make a stream, we can't just forget about that. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
it does. We got it. Thanks, Wayne.
You're
Wayne,
sorry, I'm there.
And Wayne, since you can't see everybody on the screen, we'll go ahead and choose the next person for you. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. So we're going to call on Ernie.
Thank you. I'm Ernie Nemi. I'm president of Natural Resource Economics in the Eugene area. I've been working on issues related to this for a very, very long time. What I hope we get out of this at the end is that we are able to develop recommendations for the department and the commission so that they will explicitly consider the value of the ecosystem services that Oregonians enjoy because of beavers. And we show them a way to make decisions so that they maximize the net value of those the net economic value of those ecosystem services, taking full account into the costs that people have mentioned earlier. And if they decide not to maximize the net benefits, that they fully explain why. Thank you.
Ernie, who would you call on next? I think
I don't have a clue who's left.
that's what happens when we get to this point. I don't think we've heard from Samantha.
I can go. I'm always popcorn to last because of the funky last name. So it's Brugger, as my husband says, Brugger, like that. It's fun. My name's Samantha Brugger. I am the wildlife coexistence campaigner for Wild Earth Guardians. And I hope that we end up with rules, but also resources that make it easier to coexist with beaver.
What do you think, Samantha? Can you see who might be left?
Oh my gosh.
Do you need some help?
I think Derek. Did Derek?
Yep, we haven't heard from Derek. Good job.
Okay, woohoo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Derek Broman. I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in carnivores and mesomammals. I am the ODFW Carnivore Fur Bear Coordinator. At the end of this process, I hope that all parties are able to speak the same language in order to better understand similar and shared priorities and then the knowledge gaps and necessary steps that are required to achieve shared goals. So next person, I don't think Chris Jordan has gone yet. I think We'll go to him next, please.
All right, thanks, Derek, for the handoff. I'm Chris Jordan. I'm a research fisheries biologist with the National Marine Fisheries Service, the Science Center out of Corvallis. I'm a Science Center of 1 in Corvallis, which I'm glad because it was way hotter in Seattle the last few days. So I've been working on these issues, as folks have, other folks have pointed out, that they have professional and personal interests. I'm vested in this topic very much so as a ESA salmon specialist for National Marine Fisheries Service with focus on coho on the Oregon coast and steelhead in the interior of Oregon. And what I hope comes out of this process, I hope that that across Oregon, we all can improve. And it's going to take all of us. It's not just the state agencies or the federal agencies. We can all improve how we manage riverscapes for function and health. That means water quality and quantity, wild and fire resilience, sensitive species benefits, climate change mitigation, but this must include an explicit consideration of beaver. It can't be left out of that picture. And I will call on Shannon Hearn.
Thanks, Chris. And good job. That was a game of like match, and you won because you're the final one, and I think I'm the final one to go maybe. My name is Shannon Hearn. I'm the Deputy Director at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. As Kevin mentioned, we have a couple people on today that are agency staff that are alternates or sharing a seat. Part of the importance of us being here for this first meeting is to hear this commonality and where this work group wants to go and where we can help. And if I have one hope, building on what Chris said and Ernie said, it is really, there's a lot of institutional knowledge, a lot of good science and familiarity with this topic in this group. But at the end of the day, hopefully we can make some strong recommendations to the commission, but also we can decide how to message this to all Oregonians so they understand the importance of this and those recommendations, hopefully that everyone is able to get to. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everybody, for participating in that. It is really helpful to hear everyone's voice and you know, start to attribute what your expectations for outcomes are, or your hopes. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the next agenda item, which is looking at the some of the outcomes of the convening interview summary. But actually, before we do that, there's one clarification I want to make about participation. So we've got several people here in the introductions that are alternates for other people. So for example, you know, Michael is here as an alternate for Leland, but Leland's not here. And so when if Leland joins us at our next meeting, we'll make sure that he introduces himself. And then we have, you know, you heard that Matt isn't necessarily an alternate for Tom. He's more of a shadow. Is that right, Matt? Would you say? Yeah. So so Matt is more of an observer of the process. And so I just wanted to clarify that. And then Tyler Dungannon, is that right, Amy? Yeah. So Tyler Dungannon, he is on the trap check, which we're going to meet tomorrow, and he will be an alternate for Amy, and he is not here. But we have Brian and Scott. So Scott is actually an alternate for Brian, and they're both here, and that's fine because we get to, you know, Scott got to introduce himself, so y'all got to meet him. But in terms of participation, when alternates are, you know, participating in the meeting together with their primaries, we just ask that they sit in an observer mode, because otherwise we end up with, you know, just a lot of duplication in terms of participation. And so, so we'll ask that of Scott today. And then, you know, Kevin will be an alternate for Shannon. And he already mentioned that. And Jill is actually an alternate for Becky. And so I think that's all the alternates we have.
I'm an alternate for Greg.
Oh, you're an alternate for Greg.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm kind of going month to month here.
Yeah.
At the governor's pleasure. I just wondering, is Wayne an alternate for Josh? I only recalled one BLM representative initially.
Wayne is is who I brought, Greg. He's not an alternate for anyone.
I see. Okay.
Wayne is representing himself fully.
Okay, thanks.
And so Danielle, you had your hand up.
Yeah, and I'm just making sure Jefferson with Onda, he's here, but just not here today.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, I was just going to say that. So Jefferson with Onda, the Oregon Natural Desert Association can't be here today. He let us know that in advance. And then Josh Chapman, who's with the U.S. Forest Service, couldn't make it today. But otherwise, we have a full house. So I just wanted to clarify about the participation, so that, you know, people that are sharing a seat are also not sharing the airtime in the same meeting. And so with that, let's go ahead and take a look at the review the outcomes of the convening interview summary. And it's hard to believe that after, you want to share that one slide, Sam? That after meeting with everybody for an hour or more, we met with some people for a little bit more than an hour because they had more to share with us, that we could distill everybody's thoughts down to a 14-page summary. And then what's even more remarkable is to distill it down to one slide. And it is not at all a reflection of the importance of everything we heard. It's more, I was trying to roll up some of the highlights of what we heard. So I hope you have had a chance to take a look at it. It's not unlike other assessment summaries that maybe you've participated in, where we don't attribute the names to people, and we try to organize it in a way so that it's succinct and it isn't a verbatim. Certainly, if you see glaring gaps in things that you talk with us about that are not there, you should feel free to message us, email us, call me. We can make those amendments. This is a draft. I didn't think we would take that time in the meeting today to do that. But what I did think we would take some time in the meeting today is just to hear some reflections of, was there anything really surprising? Is there anything very concerning? Just did you learn something new? Just those kinds of high level questions about the survey. And so again, if you have specifics of things that when you read it, you're like, oh man, we talked about all these other things that aren't here. Email Sam and I, and we will make those adjustments to the assessment, but also recognize that this is a summary. So we don't want to leave main things out, but we're also not going to include verbatim transcripts either. So, Marianne.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this feedback may also relate to the charter. And I'd like to hear from, it might be a question for the commission, it might be a question for you or for the agency. Well, I have a couple pieces of feedback, but I think most of them get to the charter. But for this one, I guess what surprised me is when I had talked about, concerns around if we have the breadth of people at the table that should be at the table. I was assured that this is just about trapping beaver on federal lands and ODFW's regulations around that. I will say all of those responses seemed a lot broader than that to me, as well as even some of the hopes that people expressed here today. I would like clarification, and quite frankly, the charter seems broader than that to me. I would like clarification on the scope of what our charge is here today. I'm not putting you on the spot for if people answered questions specific to that, because I think that's, those answers are fine with whatever people wanted to say. But to me, they struck that maybe we all had a little bit of a different idea about why we were here and what problem we were trying to solve, what the scope of our, if we're looking into pulling things over from ODA's program, I wonder why ODA isn't here. If we're looking at beaver management across private landscapes, I wonder why I'm the only representative of private landowners here. So I just have a lot of concerns about whether the breadth of the work group is appropriately reflective of the scope of what we're talking about. And if I have a misunderstanding of the scope being limited to federal lands, or if others just got a little broad in their discussions and the charter just got a little broader than we intended.
Thanks, Marianne. I see that Greg's got his hand up.
Okay, so actually, thank you for that, Marianne, because that's kind of what I was alluding to that I didn't speak to in the very beginning, but I thought we would wait and get to the charter. Because, I mean, the reason why we were called together, why it is because our commission was asked to either initiate rulemaking or not initiate rulemaking about whether or not beaver should be trapped on public lands. So obviously this is not a simple yes or no question. That's why we have a dozen or so people, on this committee. And it's much broader and deeper and more complex than simply making a decision on yes or no. But that is the mandate that we received, that the commission received from the public to act on at the beginning of this, or act on at the end of this process. And so I don't want that to be lost as we go through all that we do. And I feel that in terms of the mission and purpose of the charter, that should probably be included, because we're going to go over, under, around, and through and down rabbit holes in a lot of different places. But that's, when we reconvene, when the commission reconvenes, that's something that we have to address. So I do would like us to keep that in mind.
So if I can make a proposal then to add under the mission purpose, where it said, there's the first sentence of the Beaver Management Work Group will develop recommendations to the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Commission to consider regarding ODFW policies, practices, and programs related to beaver management in Oregon, specifically to address the question of trapping beaver on federal land. Would that clarify it?
I will say, I think that statement still feels very broad to me in terms of policies, practices, and programs related to beaver management in Oregon. And if we are going to talk about some of those broader topics, and I heard a lot of people wanting to talk about the broader science of beaver management, the broader policies around beaver management, again, there's just people that need to be at this table that I had, when I understood it to be a broader topic, asked for them to be included and was told no, because we're only talking about federal lands. And so to me, it's, and I think Commissioner Woolley's comment kind of gets to the root of my question, because are we gonna, talk about, I'm using my Zoom on this tiny screen, my hand, so sorry. Are we gonna talk about beaver management, all of the things, and then eventually narrow in on, federal lands recommendation? And if so, I think that we need to have all of the relevant people to all of the things at the table. If we're only talking about the science as it relates to public lands, the practices as it relates to public lands, management as it relates to public lands, I think that's a different conversation. But I think the statement you read to me doesn't suggest that our conversation is only limited to public lands. It just suggests that the ultimate recommendation is only limited to public lands. And I do think that's relevant to me, again, in terms of the fact that I'm the only organization representing private landowners here, the fact that we don't have a forestry organization representing forest private landowners or anybody that does public lands logging, for example. And so there's some missing pieces if we're going to have that broader conversation, even if it's with a goal of getting to just the recommendation around federal lands. And so my question is still, are we talking about all the things and then narrowing in on federal lands, or are we only ever talking science on federal lands and process on our public lands and process on public lands?
Commissioners, do you have any clarification for Marianne about that? Becky?
Well, I'll jump in, and Greg, you Commissioner Woolley, feel free to correct me, or Jill, if you feel like this is wrong. I do feel ultimately that the question before us was about trapping on federal lands, and looking at federal lands, there was a lot of conversation about climate change and the role beavers might play in relation to climate change, and what might be done on federal forest lands in Oregon. My understanding was the scope of this group is not about all the beaver in the state of Oregon on private land or living in cities, or I just don't feel like that was the focus of what brought this group together. So just talking about beaver on federal land gives us so much opportunity to cover all kinds of important issues.
I agree with Commissioner Hatfield-Hyde, and I feel that when we're talking about science, we're talking about ecology, we're talking about riparian ecology, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about habitat. It's general and it is broad. It pertains to federal lands and it pertains to everywhere where beaver exists. And so I think it's okay to talk about it's important to talk about the bigger topics, including climate change, because it relates to federal lands, and it's just important across the board. Commissioner?
I just had one other thought, which is that I respect Mary Ann's concern, because if what we were doing is talking about all beavers across Oregon on all private land, that's a really different thing. And I guess I just want to respect that is not what I think this is about. And she has a right to be concerned if she thinks that's what this is about, but I don't think it is. I just don't think that's the mandate that we were asked.
I agree.
And Stan, I see your hand up, but let me, so can either of the commissioners speak to the Mary Ann's second concern about makeup of the committee?
I can throw that out there because I think that the committee is fine given the scope of the committee. If the committee was actually addressing beaver on private land in Oregon, then she would be absolutely right. It is not, the committee wouldn't be weighted fairly, in my opinion. So, but Mary Ann, I was hoping that given that it's the lesser scope, you would be like, okay, I hear you. It's a lesser scope. We're not talking about beaver everywhere yeah. Not that some of what we learn can't have impacts broader, right? Or not that we can't learn from one another broader. That's what we ought to be doing. But yeah, I hope if Mary Ann would think that's okay.
And we can circle back to, I know Ernie's got his hand up, so I'll talk again at the end.
Yeah, and so Stan was next and then Ernie, and before we hear from Stan, it's not uncommon in these work groups that you start talking about things that involve people that are not at the table. And I think that it's going to be just really imperative and important that this group recognize when that begins to occur. And it might be that that's part of your recommendations, that around these conversations, around these issues, these other folks need to be involved. And that's part, and that might be another, a different discussion at a different time. But just really being aware of, when the group starts getting out over its skis and who's not in the room is a really important, something very important for us all to be watchful of. Stan, go ahead, and then Ernie. And remember to unmute, Stan. It's that little
red.
There you go. You got it.
It takes a second to come up. I'm going to reflect a little bit on what Mary Ann said. And, what we're talking about, this is salmon recovery and the importance of beaver ecosystem engineers, yada, 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 all the good stuff that we all love beaver for. We have to remember the premise of the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds was that we did include all of our private land partners in making those policy decisions because we knew that they were going to impact both federal public lands as well as state lands as well as private lands. We're not talking about, in many of these cases, where there's not interspersed public land with private land ownership. It's going to be kind of hard, I think, to separate some of those issues. Another thing is on makeup. I'm really concerned that one of the key components here, who does wildlife damage control on federal lands, is Wildlife Services. They are the agency that the federal agencies first approach if they have management problems with different species, not just beaver, but different species. They're not at the table. They're the actual damage management control people on federal lands. So that's confusing to me that Wildlife Services isn't present. And then the keynote that we talk about keystone species. Well, let's talk about key researchers. One of the nation's most prominent researchers. And I know Dr. Jordan and Dr. Kaufman will agree that Dr. Jimmy Taylor is one of the key beaver researchers in the United States. And he has a fantastic associate in Vanessa Petro. They would be able to give us, I think, balanced beaver research, what should I say, just analysis. And so, I think for us to even talk about one single beaver activity on federal lands would have to have one of the key beaver researchers included in this panel. So, and ODFW has fantastic economists. We need ODFW's economists to also be analyzing the economic contributions. Shouldn't just hear it from the proponent of restrictions. We should hear it from objective scientists. In other words, an economist that is just looking at this objectively. And we're concerned that that's not always the case. So the makeup of the committee as it stands does concern the community that I represent, the sporting community. And if you look around all the faces on here, there's one of us. And Amy, maybe two of us, but we're actually I'm actually representing the people who could potentially be most impacted if there's undue restrictions put in place. So that's one of us. And then I'll go on a little further. We're also the same group of people that the Oregon Forest Industries Council, the farmers, and others reach out to help them in management situations. So I'll leave it at that. I could go on forever.
Thanks, Dan. So Ernie was next, and then Danielle, and then Brian. Ernie, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Before I give my general comments, I'd like to respond to Stan just very briefly, because I think he alluded to me as the economist who is a proponent of more restrictions, and that's absolutely not correct. I want to be very clear. If the benefits of trapping or killing a beaver exceed the cost, kill the damn beaver, because that's the only way that we get an increase in net benefits. If the costs exceed the benefits, then killing the beaver makes us worse off. And so that's the only position that I come from. There's been discussion here about who is affected most and who's not at the table. The economic research shows, I believe, very clearly that the people who are most affected by actions that improve salmon populations or improve water quality are people who live in the biggest cities. And there are millions of them. And so there are an awful lot of people who are not represented here. I don't believe we can have a group that represents everybody to everybody's satisfaction. So let's just try to have a process where we account for what are the impacts on different groups, what are the benefits, what are the costs, who gets the benefits, who gets the costs. And if we are candid about that, then I think we can provide information that is useful to everybody. So thank you.
Thanks, Ernie. Danielle, and then we've got a slew of hands up. It was Danielle and then Brian. And it looks like Samantha, you were able to raise your hand. I know that Lauren is in the queue as well. So let's just get those folks on board. So it's Danielle, Brian, and Samantha. Danielle?
Thank you. And thanks, Marianne, for bringing up the charter, because I'm in agreement in that. Obviously what sort of kicked this off in the initial discussion before the commission was a petition specific to federal lands and trapping. And I wasn't on the petition, so I wasn't as deeply involved. But if I recall the commission discussion, I think sort of where it went was, and the logic behind the petition is this is a tool toward getting toward those benefits that people, that the petitioners saw from Beaver. And so just because of some of the challenges of who regulates beaver on public versus private land, that's why they started with the federal land. But if I recall, the commission that's where they went into, hey, we're talking, this was supposed to be a tool to address drought, wildfire, climate change, what is management, what is the restoration? So I actually thought this was supposed to have a bigger scope, with the idea that they were going to come out with specific recommendations before the Fish and Wildlife Commission. That's the reason they denied that petition in the first place. And I don't disagree that impacted communities shouldn't be part of this discussion, but as far as specific language that would go into rulemaking, I think, this is some of the challenge with the fact that ODFW doesn't have authority on private land. So that's a legislative challenge or, discrepancy. And so I don't know. That's just mumble jumbled thoughts, but I'm actually a little bit more in the camp thinking this was supposed to be about what are the tools in the toolbox we need, because the commission seemed to be emphasizing that we need to be looking at this landscape wide. We can't just do this single focus thing on federal lands. We want the benefits of beavers across all public lands. That's our authority. What does that look like? Restoration, management, and the like. So that's kind of where my brain was as well.
Thanks, Danielle. Next, I've got Brian and then Samantha. And Lauren, I'm going to have you go after Samantha.
Yeah, thanks. And a lot of what I was going to say, I think Danielle said. I'll try not to be redundant and try to be brief. But yeah, I just wanted to say that it seems to me that the public policy issues around beaver management definitely extend beyond just federal public lands, recognizing that the Department of Fish and Wildlife's authority may be highly constrained on private lands. And I guess I would specifically wonder about state lands. Why shouldn't that be included in the mix, even if it may be a small amount of property? But you know, that being said, I totally understand Mary Ann's concerns about private landowner representation. And at the end of the day, I also, you know, it seems to me, maybe I'm incorrect, but it seems to me it's the, you know, up to the commission to define what our charge is, and maybe the intent is that it be limited to what was within the scope of the rulemaking petition. You know, I would hate to see though that the charge is defined in a way to suggest that there isn't an issue that extends beyond federal public lands in terms of beaver management. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian. Samantha, you took your hand down, or are you just ready to go?
Down. Brian kind of covered what I was thinking.
All right, Lauren.
Yeah, I didn't need to speak. I was just seconding that, I felt, and I think I expressed this to you, that it would be important to have wildlife services in this group as well, because we do contract with them for a lot of this beaver management, and we feel that their voice is important to the discussion.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm going to call on Amy, and then Greg, I'm going to have call on you after Amy, because you're the last hand up. Okay, Amy, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to mention real quick. One, I did find it interesting, and this goes to the makeup of the group. Becky's comment about, Commissioner Hyde's comment about if this was a topic that went with broader scope of land ownership, that the makeup of the group would not be perhaps appropriate, which I agree with, but I do raise the same concern about the current makeup for the scope of what we're talking about as well. It does seem a bit unbalanced, that we maybe don't have all the voices in the room. Beyond that, I agree with Mary Ann in that I think a lot of us felt the original scope of this work group was based in the request that came before the commission last June, and then the petition in November. Excuse me, that's my driveway alarm in the background. And I believe that was something that most of us came into this thinking that was the scope, that this is regarding the petition that was specifically towards trapping on federal lands. And that was what we were approaching. I concur with folks that see the broader picture, and obviously landscape level discussions are productive when we're talking about species management. It's very difficult to talk about these things in silos of land ownership. But again, I kind of call back to the fact of where can we actually affect work, and that is within ODFW's scope, because this is an ODFW work group. And the old, I don't know if it's a joke or an analogy about how do you eat the elephant, one bite at a time. If we have these really broad, ideas of what we want to do, that's great. But I feel like to be productive, we're going to have to narrow some of this down. We're going to have to narrow the scope. We're going to have to narrow perhaps expectations on both sides of the table. I'm not sure there, but if we're going to eat the elephant, we got to be able to at least come to the table with a fork and begin at some point. So those are my thoughts, and I'll stop talking about eating elephants now.
Thank you, Amy. Go ahead, Greg, you're up.
Okay, thank you. So I agree with Mary Ann and Stan and others have said that potentially more knowledgeable people could have been in the room and perhaps could have added valuable information to the discussion. part of the strategy, in addition to striving for balance, was also to have a manageable size group so that, everyone could have an opportunity to speak, and that it's, easier also for our facilitators to manage the process. So that's why, we have two researchers, two very knowledgeable, competent researchers. We could have had 3, 4, 5, or 6. I felt that 2 was enough. We also, what we talked about with facilitators, to have a, for lack of a better term, I don't think we landed on a term, but kind of a scientific advisory group that we could bring in when specific topics come up, where we can call on their expertise and bring them into the room. And that could be Jimmy Taylor, it could be Benetta Petro, or others that have stepped forward and wanted to be a part of that. So again, there's always going to be folks that, as Jamie said earlier, folks to add, other folks that feel left out and that sort of thing. But, at some point we just need to get started. It was a long ramp up to get going, and it's happening. And so I'm really excited about that. And I feel that we need to move forward.
So I don't see any other hands up.
I wanted to say something.
Who did? Oh,
Jordan.
Chris? And then Stan?
Yeah, sorry, I'm on the browser version and I can't figure out the controls for the raising the hands. That's a limitation of being on a federal computer, but I'll work on that. That's my problem. Thank you for the tip, Samantha. I'll see if I can dig into that. So I guess I wanted to circle back to the Mary Ann's comment about the limitation of the scope or the charge of this work group around trapping on a potential trapping ban on federal lands, and maybe channel the petitioners, not being one of them, but having spoken in support of the concept of a beaver management approach at the hearings. I think it was a tool to achieve an objective, and the objective was an increase in watershed health in the state. And there's lots of different ways to achieve that. And the first bite of the elephant, I like that, was to ask, are there ways to increase populations of beavers in a particular part of the landscape in Oregon, in this case federal managed lands, and see if those federal lands respond the same way they have in every other place there's been a trapping ban, that you get more animals, you get more beaver dams, you get more watershed, and the ecosystem services that Ernie spoke to. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about the benefits. But you can't manage for the benefits. You can't go tell a watershed to get better, and you need a tool. And in this case, beaver managed hydrology is the tool. So then how does ODFW manage for beaver managed hydrology? And it's that logic chain that I think the petitioners were trying to kick off. And if we might all want those benefits of the watersheds, but how do we get them? And this might be one of those tools. And if so, then rulemaking is necessary to give ODFW that structure to do it. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Sam, was there another hand up?
Stan, I believe.
Stan, go ahead, Stan.
Okay, I appreciate what Dr. Jordan said, and I think that's one of the premises of why Dr. Jimmy Taylor and Vanessa need to be part of this work group. They're actually beaver biologists, not hydrologists, but actually people that will be able to talk about, well, the DNA of beaver and what beaver specifically can do and what they can't do. But the premise of what I'm hearing here is to the base question that I've had fear of all along. There's an assumption by many in this work group that Oregon's current beaver management policies are the reason beaver are not everywhere. And that there's an assumption that the current harvest of beaver is the reason we don't see beaver, and some of these streams have been closed to beaver for over 50 years. So is the premise of this group that beaver trapping on federal lands is what's limiting beaver on federal lands? And if that's the question, can this group deal with the actual scientific data, empirical data that will show us the current beaver harvest is impeding habitat, salmon recovery, or beaver population's persistence and viability? Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Becky?
Okay, so I think that Commissioner Woolley said something really, really great about 10 minutes ago, which is that we can have, I don't know what your term for it was, an advisory science group to this group when we come up against problems that we don't feel like we have the knowledge in-house in this group. And I think we have addressed this idea that we have limited our scope to federal lands. And I think some of those things that Stan is talking about are the kind of work we need to get into talking about sooner rather than later. And I mean, I think it's really good that we express our worst fears. I mean, for Stan, I would think his worst fear would be that we are going to end all trapping on federal land here in Oregon. And, you know, maybe, you know, for, I don't know who, maybe for Boone, he's concerned that none of us will understand that significant role that beaver can play at times in systems to help upgrade systems, you know, and that we won't ever get to that, or we'll overlook that. But I think we have I think we might have a chance to just trust one another and go forward here, because I think if we feel like we need more science, we can get more science. I mean, and maybe even beyond the people Stan is talking about or Marianne is talking about. Anyway, I think, you know, I think it's like what Jamie said at the very beginning. What's the ground rule, Jamie? It has to do with like, come in good faith.
Mm-hmm. Act in good faith. Yeah.
Act in good faith. And I know we're all exhausted here in Oregon, and some of you have just come out of this brutal legislative session where people are pounding on one another, and maybe we're not getting along very well, and you know, but let's maybe just give ourselves a chance to try the good faith approach, because the alternative is we just fight with each other, whether we have this working group or not. So perhaps we extend good faith to each other, and don't extend this to private lands, because we will freak out everybody in the state of Oregon, that will make everyone panic. And that's all I have to say, is that I'm glad you guys are here, and let's go forth and do good things.
Thanks, Becky. And so let's pause for just a moment and make sure that we've got some level of support. I won't use the word agreement, but just support about the central charge of the group. Because that's, you know, the activity that Sam and I had put together for us to do is really looking at taking kind of a deep dive in all the key questions that were raised and starting to prioritize those and sort those. It's possible we could get into that. I'm not sure we will, given the time that we have, but I have an idea of how we can get there, you know, after this meeting. But I think this question of the scope of authority and the charge of this group is foundational, you know, to us being successful. So, you know, we've had a lot of conversation here about that, you know, what preceded the formation of this group, and the central question that Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is trying to address, which is trapping on federal lands, yes or no. It's not clearly that black and white, but, you know, are there some things that ODFW should be doing differently around that question? And so so I'll start with the federal lands part of that question first, because we've heard a lot of reactions around the participation in this group based on, you know, how large an area are we talking about? So is there anybody on this group that disagrees with the federal lands focus?
Can somebody just explain why it's federal as opposed to public lands?
Okay, who can explain that? Maybe Greg?
Well, it's just what came to us in the petition. And so our charge is to address, and I think it was Danielle that mentioned that, this is what we've been asked to address. And so that's what we're focusing on. Taking everything else in consideration in a bigger picture.
And if it were to include state lands or local government lands, how does that, does that start to change who's here? Marianne's laughing. Are you laughing at me or what are you laughing at? So let's just make sure that we're talking what we're talking.
I felt
Go
like you
ahead.
very casually just took the scope from like, it was like very casual, like, oh, what if it's this? And that's why I was laughing. Because I do think state lands is different than federal lands, particularly, again, not to beat a fed horse, I think we say these days. But you know, we don't have the forestry sector here, and forest practices are a big part of state-owned lands. And you know, I'll let Lauren speak to local governments, but there's quite a lot more cross-pollination with private infrastructure when you get into the local government lands. And so I just think those are all different conversations than the federal lands only piece.
So just sticking with this question about the federal lands, thank you for that clarification, Brian, about public. So Kevin.
Yeah, I'm just going to add a note on the state lands, particularly on our state wildlife area lands. We, have management plans that are reviewed in the full public process, and some of those discussions certainly include trapping on those lands, management, ecosystem services across a breadth of species. So we certainly already incorporate those conversations as part of our wildlife area management plan. So just wanted to bring that out in regard to the state lands that we manage.
Thanks, Kevin. So is there anybody else that wanted to weigh in on that question of if they disagreed with the federal? Oh, Jefferson. Hey, Jefferson, you didn't get a chance to introduce yourself to everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, and I apologize. I had technical difficulties and stressed with Zoom, so I'm sure you all can relate, but I'm here now.
Hey, but before, actually, Jefferson, before you weigh in on this, can you remind everybody who you are, the organization that you're with? And we asked everybody before, when we first got started, to answer the question at the end of this process. I hope that. Can you do all of those things and then weigh in?
Wow. All right. Yes. So my name is Jefferson Jacobs. I am the riparian restoration coordinator for the Oregon Natural Desert Association. And so for the past 10 years or so, 10, 15 years, I've been helping implement beaver enabling restoration in Eastern Oregon. And so I spend a lot of time on the creeks doing work and thinking about beavers in the ecosystem and working with private and public folks. And then at the end of this process, I hope that we can still respect each other's opinions and feel as though we have all been heard, but that we can also respectfully come to some sort of understanding. I hope that I'm going to be able to say something that's going to move the needle with people that aren't necessarily seeing things the same way as me, and vice versa. I want to better understand what it is that other folks are talking about, because right now I feel like it's apples and oranges, that one person is saying this and we respond with an answer down here, and we're not talking even about the same thing. So I really hope that this process brings us together, and in the end we end up with healthy ecosystems, not just for wildlife but also for the people that live there. So
all right, thank you for doing that, Jefferson. Now the question on the table is federal land focus.
Yeah. So I was part of the petition originally, and although I wasn't you know, there's so much so many moving parts in it. But in my mind, the federal lands portion of it came from the evolution of how it came to be. And so there was initially aspects of having it be national forest and such. And then really trying to zero in on where the ecological impact could be the most beneficial, and that is in headwater streams. And so focusing in on federal national forests and a lot of the BLM areas that involve some of these smaller streams where beavers could build dams is a lot more impactful than focusing on the lower downstream areas. And that's a reflection of the idea that it's not about how many beavers are on the landscape, but what the ecosystem looks like based on beavers managing that landscape. So that's a vote in favor of federal inclusion rather than lower valley stuff.
I gathered that. Thank you for summing it up at the end. So anybody else want to weigh in on this federal question? And then I have something to summarize about it. And the question on the table was there anybody that disagreed with this group having a federal lands focus? Okay, I'm not seeing any disagreement. So one thing I will say, and is that, so if you have a federal lands focus, I understand that there are, as you're talking about this, you might see that there are applications to what you're talking about that could be on state lands, or could be on private lands, or could be on local government lands. And again, going back to what I said earlier about recognizing who's not in the room, and that part of your set of recommendations could be, you know, here, ODFW Commission, here's what we think you should consider around trapping and around beaver management on federal lands. If you want to go to that second one, I haven't asked you that yet. And you know, here's some other considerations of, you know, things that as we've had these conversations, here's some other considerations that you might want to consider a process or a conversation or a partnership or whatever words you want to around these other topics. And so it's not to say when we have to have a siloed conversation isn't very helpful, but we're trying to have a focused conversation. And so the focused conversation will, you know, as in doing that, there's going to be aspects of that are outside of that focus. And I think it's important that we don't lose the focus, but it's also important that we represent the conversation. And so if there are aspects of the conversation that are useful for maybe a future discussion or another work group or some other area of work with ODFW and other agencies, I think that gets captured in your recommendations. So that's the challenge I would give to you, is to keep that in mind. So we've agreed on a federal focus. Good job. The second question that I would have is around the trapping focus. So the trapping is what brought us to the table, but we've heard a lot about, but the trapping really was a step in toward the conversation around the role that beavers play on the landscape. And so it really isn't about just trapping yes, trapping no. In order to understand the effect of trapping on federal lands, we need to understand these other things. So I'm going to pause there and see, did I accurately capture that? Or do people want to do friendly amendments? Because I think it's really important. My goal at the end of this meeting is that if we don't do anything else but walk away with a clear charge, that will be success. If we do other things, great, but we cannot leave this meeting but not having a clear charge on what we're doing. Marianne, and then Stan.
Stan probably has a more articulate thought than me to share, because I was lowering my hand at the same time y'all were. Because I feel like I can see both ways, because to me the ODFW hook, right, is the trapping. That's their kind of management objective. And I feel, and this is where the staff's gonna have to help me out, if we're talking broader promotion of beaver habitat, isn't that more of like an Oregon conservation strategy kind of conversation, an Oregon conservation strategy kind of revision? That again, if we're talking habitat, that feels to me like it'd be hard to constrain to just one land type, because you're not talking about an action occurring on a piece of land anymore, right? You're talking about this broad landscape feature. It just feels like a different conversation. So for me, I think I've now talked through this and feel like it's trapping, because the other conversation, while important, feels broader and more like an Oregon conservation strategy, and hopefully something that at least for our lens is approached through more of like a collaborative approach in terms of looking at, you know, incentives and tools for landowners and the kinds of things that the conservation strategy often gets at, as opposed to regulatory tools around trapping.
Okay, Stan, Marianne invited you to say what she just said more succinct and eloquently. So that's your charge.
I think she hit it. And I think if we're, for those of us who have been around this fish policy for years, we always talk about the 3 H's: habitat, harvest, and hatcheries. And obviously, thank God we don't have to talk about hatcheries here in this issue. But the habitat issue is a key element of the discussion. And I think all of us recognize that we have really single species managed for decades now in our recovery plans, stressing certain benefits to fish from shading, old growth along streams and all of that, which is excluded, especially on the west side, coast side, the best beneficial habitat that will promote beaver. So I think the habitat issue is absolutely as important as the harvest issue. And so right now, the assumption, once again, is that we're over-harvesting beaver to the point through the recreational harvest that we are impacting their ability to recolonize or to build dams. I just don't think the data supports that. But as trappers nationwide, and specifically Oregon, we are extremely, extremely hopeful that we can be engaged in getting that data scientifically so that we can make good policy based on the best available science, not on people's feelings, assumptions, or inclinations. We are willing to do whatever it takes through harvest reporting, whatever it may be, down to watershed level, stream reach. We have all of this at our capabilities. Using the salmon steelhead code, we can give you exact data, sex, size, age, where, when, and even down to the type of best management practices traps used. So we're here for this discussion because we realize too that in many cases in the Coast Range, beaver are absent, so are the trappers. So it's an issue prior to more than just the harvest issue by humans. So we're here for it. Great discussion, limit it to federal ground, and you're going to find us doing everything possible to make sure beaver are everywhere they should be and abundant.
Thank you, Stan. Ernie, and then Chris. Hey, Ernie, you're still muted.
Sorry.
No worries.
Again, I come at this from the perspective of economics. And so I'm really not very concerned about the numbers of beavers. I'm really not concerned about the numbers of trappers. I'm concerned about the benefits and the costs that we get, in this case, from federal lands through the mediation of beavers. And so if we were going to limit this discussion or the regulations to how many trappers, then that doesn't seem very interesting. It doesn't seem like it serves the people of Oregon. It doesn't seem like it starts to address the climate change issues, the biodiversity crisis, the problems that we have with water quality in this state, as well as salmon, as well as birds, as well as beavers themselves. So I don't know where we are. I thought we were going to look at beavers on federal lands in Oregon and what can we do to have more or fewer, whatever the numbers tell us. But then we seem to get, it sounded to me like we were getting distracted onto, well, how many trappers are we going to have?
Thanks, Ernie. Let's hear from Chris and then Amy, and then let me pause and I'll summarize where I think we are. Chris?
Okay, thanks. And thanks for the tips, Marianne, for figuring out how to raise my hand. So I guess I'd like to say clearly that I don't see a problem with recreational or infrastructure, problem management, lethal removal. Period. If that's the best tool, if that's a recreational opportunity, that's fantastic. That should be an option. What I think is on the table here, and obviously, as Stan said, people are doing that now and not complaining about lack of opportunity. So I would say ODFW is doing a reasonable job of making trapping opportunities available. But that's not the question, I think. And I think the question is managing for population numbers of beavers that provide trapping opportunities is not the right objective to make fish habitat. So it's an apples and oranges question, and I think that's where we're talking past each other. That if we want those benefits from watersheds that we have demonstrated scientifically in many places across the country and in Oregon, that beaver dominated watersheds deliver those benefits for the people of Oregon. Now, can they also support regular recreational harvest? And I think that's more of the question. And that's been demonstrated possible in places where there are much more robust beaver populations. That's how Canada manages its trapping concessions. And so it's possible. But if we're not at those levels in Oregon, then we have to adjust our management strategies such that we can get, and this is what Ernie, I think, is trying to say, if we want the benefits out of the watershed and beaver are part of the management community, then how do we get that? How do we achieve that? And my take on it as a population biologist across species is that if the populations are big enough, they can withstand harvest. That's how all commercial fisheries work. That's how all recreational fisheries work. There's room for harvest if the population is robust enough. And so I think the question around lethal removal of beaver, whether it's recreational trapping or whether it's damage control removals, is can that source of mortality be withstood by the populations of beaver in particular watersheds or across the entire state and allow the watershed benefits? And I think the data is very clear from ODFW's monitoring programs on the state that it can't at the moment. That's not to say that it won't be forever. So we need a rebuilding plan to make robust populations that give us those watershed properties, and then make an excess of trapping of beaver populations for trapping opportunities. And so it's not forever things. It's how do we rebuild watersheds that give us all these services, including opportunities for harvest of beaver. And if we're not there yet on the objective of the watershed, then we're premature in imposing other management strategies. And I agree with Stan around our management practices involve forestry practices that have changed the landscape for beaver too. So this is a bigger question, but the one tool that we're asking is, can the beaver populations withstand particular imposed mortality if we want the watersheds to deliver these other services? So it's not about the numbers of beaver that are taken, it's about the number of beaver on the landscape that make the services that we as Oregonians want. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So Amy and Marianne, and then I need to summarize where we are because we have like 15 minutes left of our meeting.
I will not take much time here. I just, and Chris, I appreciate what you just said there. And I go back, hearkening back to the question of, what is our scope here again, as far as trapping and non-trapping, or a broader scope as we look at this. If this is a habitat question, which I think everybody on here can agree that habitat is one of the main things that is going to impact our beaver populations. We can make recommendations in what we find through this process, and that's great. But again, we're talking about federal land that ODFW does not have, jurisdiction to implement those habitat needs that we may find as we walk through this. And so I just think that's something to keep in mind. so that we are managing expectations when we come to those. The other thing I'd like to point out though too is there have been numerous trapping bans on national forests throughout the state, some as old as 40 years, and there has been no data that has been provided in those areas that have shown a real good correlation between that and the beaver population. So for me, what I would really enjoy after the last year of, kind of getting into this and listening to both sides and really kind of digging into this topic, I would really enjoy being able to have some kind of a controlled setup, some kind of a research project where we can find some similar conditions, similar drainages, be able to do a control area of no trapping, to continue a trapping on a similar one, and then really be able to run that for a few years and get some science that we can point to that's both state specific and just really current in what the beaver population is. So I don't know if anybody else shares that thought process, but I think that would be kind of a really interesting thing to be able to work through. And again, I just wanted to throw that kind of managed expectation thing is that, if we do come to this habitat conversation, we do still need to remember the scope of ODFW. Thank you.
So Amy, I'm going to ask you to hold that idea that you had. I mean, you jump right ahead, I think, to meeting number like 3, 4, just like right out there. And so, but hang on to that. Don't lose that. I mean, I want to make this, the conversation that we're having. So Marianne, I see your hand up, but I'm going to speak just for a minute because we have 15 minutes left. The conversation that we're having is really important that we make sure we leave with a good sense of what the scope of the group is. And I think we're really close to getting there. The second one is that, yes, Sam and I designed an exercise that we could do that I'm going to figure out how to do it in a survey after the meeting. But really the exercise was to elicit the key questions. And that's what you're doing. You're having that conversation in a more organic way. So thank you for that. We didn't need to design an exercise at all. Yeah, I all knew how to have this conversation. But I do want to make sure that we save a little bit of time to talk about the next, the schedule and the next meeting and expectations for that meeting. And that's going to take probably 10 minutes. And so if we can wrap up this part to make sure we have time for that, because that's the guidance that Sam and I and the commissioners need in order to know what we're doing next. So we've got ideas, but I'm just giving you a heads up. So Marianne?
Yeah, I think I can get my point across in less than 2 minutes. I think what Chris said is really interesting. I think it kind of presupposes that we know that population levels are insufficient. And I think that's where I really wanted the clarity between private and public lands, because the story that our folks tell us about beaver abundance on private lands is that beaver abundance is incredibly high. And that management needs to occur where there is conflict, but it's not something where management always occurs. And so I think that conversation that Chris was setting up around how land use practices affect beaver abundance, we certainly could limit that to federal lands, but it does feel like if that's the conversation we're having, again, that's the broader conversation that needs the broader table of people at it. Providing data and information and scoping out what that looks like, because I'm not convinced it does as much good to look only at federal lands if we're trying to get a sense of the health of the beaver population statewide. And so again, that's where I just have a lot of questions still, unfortunately, Jamie, about the scope of what we're doing here. And if it's really possible to limit it to just federal lands. And if it's not, then I think we need to be honest about that. And we need to recognize that we don't have the right table for that conversation. That's a broader statewide conversation, even if it's not about beaver management statewide, but rather about beaver habitat and abundance statewide. I still think we need different folks at that table. If we're designing a study, for example, about beaver population statewide, the landowners that have beaver populations on their land need to be part of that study.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Marianne. And you did do that in less than 2 minutes. So what I would suggest is that I mean, there was broad agreement that we focus on federal lands, and maybe it's less of a focus and more of a I guess it's more of a start. I mean, I think what we need to do is start having the conversation, focused on the federal lands to try to answer the question that ODFW Commission has been charged to try to address, which is the trapping issue on federal lands. And then in many ways, and I've mentioned this to you when I spoke to some of you in our convening interviews, in many ways, this group has a big sorting exercise, around these topics. And there's some that you'll be able to get traction on, and there's some that you'll be able to recognize, hey, we don't have the right people, or this conversation needs to look like X, Y, Z. And that's part of a recommendation to the commission. And that, you say, we're not the right people to have this discussion. But here's what we would encourage you, commission, to support this conversation happening that looks like this or feels like this. And so I don't know that we'll know exactly until we start having the conversation, but if we can start it with the federal land focus and with trying to address the question of the trapping issue, and then and track that as we're going forward about who is in the room and who's not, how far afield are we going, versus how focused are we being, what information do we have available to answer these questions, and what information do we need? I mean, I think that's that's kind of the push-pull of just trying to move this forward. And, I mean, sort of one scenario, and I won't call it a worst case scenario, but one scenario is, Marianne, the group meets for several times and works, tries to work those out and basically proposes an alternate process or something else to address some of these questions. I don't know where you're going to go, but I think we need to just start having the discussion and sort it and with the federal land focus. That's what I would suggest as a way to get going. Samantha?
I'm just wondering about consensus too, as we're making these choices going forward, how are we making the choices? And I just want to make sure, I hear what Marianne is saying about everyone being at the table, but I think that we'd all have different takes on who everyone includes anyway. And so I want to just make sure we have an idea of how we're going to make decisions going forward. So not any one party or person makes those decisions.
Yeah, and we've included a couple of recommendations or a couple of options in the charter about how we do that. And I think, when we spoke with everybody individually, folks did by and large agree that, we want to strive for a recommendation that everybody here can support. That's a nuanced way around consensus. Certainly if you get to full, consensus, everybody's like, yeah, this is the best set of recommendations ever, that would be great. It might be support at varying levels. And I guess that depends on what the recommendation is. But if everybody goes in with, if we've got minority reports and we've got, just a whole range of recommendations, then that sort of defeats the purpose of having a work group trying to come together around a set of recommendations for the commission to consider. So your point's well taken, Samantha, and take a look at the charter with the different options about how we would help people sort of weigh in on their level of support. And we're going to have to do some work in between meetings to resolve some of these issues.
Right. And I'm just thinking even for basic decisions, like I could say, I feel like maybe everyone's not at the table, but if no one else feels that way, great. I'm thinking, okay, if we're starting to look at private landowners, then why aren't we having climate activists too? We could take it further on the other side. We can go much further with it. So I think that the group is balanced now as is. And my concerns are that we're kind of derailing progress we can make by kind of going over this a lot in a way that hasn't felt as constructive as I would have hoped for our first meeting and setting our schedule and all that stuff.
So we've got Chris and Jefferson, and then we do need to wrap up with next steps. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to throw something on the table. It doesn't have to be addressed right now, but thought about as part of our process as a group. How do we bring forward scientific knowledge? There have been a number of claims that there are no data or no science in places where there are gobs of it. I teach these topics. I teach biology of beaver. I teach biology of stream restoration. I teach the physics of stream restoration. I teach the implementation of stream restoration. I teach fish biology. I write books and I write papers. And I talk about this topic as head-slappingly obvious because there's so much information and we need direction, an implementation direction. So that's my impression of a huge scientific body of knowledge, data, across many, many disciplines. And that's not obviously shared. That opinion, that observation, that understanding is not shared with everyone in this group. So how do we bring that forward so that it can be considered by the group? What's the process of bringing information, evidence, I don't know what to call it, forward so that the group then would have a common basis to consider?
Yeah. Yeah, and we had hoped to get to some of that today in the exercise that we identified, but I think we're probably going to have to develop a survey around those key questions and send it out in advance of the next meeting so that we can start to narrow down and populate future agendas. So we've got a number of hands up and we have 5 minutes left in our meeting. So at this point, what I'm going to do, so Jefferson, Stan, and Michael all have their hands up. And are these things that will help us to get closure in our meeting today? Stan, Jefferson, and Michael?
I can wait in interest of having scheduling and the hope to talk again in the future.
Yes, I would appreciate that. And you will have an opportunity to talk in the future. Jefferson, how about you?
Oh, Jefferson just went, but I'll just real quickly go off of what Chris said. And I think that would be great to have a place to share data and science because that's something we're all looking towards, and it'd be great to have a repository for that somewhere. And I think the sooner the better on something like that because there's gobs of data on the ecological benefits of beaver, and we all agree on that. I think what I'd really like to see is data related to trapping and beaver populations and limiting factors specific to trapping on federal lands, because that's where at least speaking for the Wildlife Society, it's just not a lot of data that we could find. So it'd be great to have all the information available.
Okay. So here's what I suggest for next steps. And thank you, Jefferson. Sorry, I called you Michael. And thank you, Michael, for clarifying that. And thank you, Stan, for putting your hand down. So in the last couple of minutes that we have, so here's what I'd suggest. So the exercise that we were going to do looked at all of the key questions in the convening interviews. We organized them into some categories, and we were going to ask people to prioritize those. That is something that's very powerful to do as a full group, but we can also do that through a survey. And so I would suggest that we go ahead and develop that survey around those key questions and send that out for us to get a sense of where your priorities are, and so that we can start to roll up what those questions are, because that's the precursor to exactly what Michael and Jefferson and Chris and a number of you are saying is, what are the questions that we need some information around, and then where do we go and get that information, and how do we start to put that in one place for us to learn from that. So that's one piece that I would suggest. The second is around schedule. We have a placeholder meeting at the end of July. We had hoped to have a longer meeting that was a field meeting. What we've learned is that state agencies are not authorized to meet in person until after September 1st. It might change, but at this point, that's what we're going with. And so, and Sam, did anything emerge in terms of a time frame for a meeting earlier than the end of July?
Yeah, so we've heard from about 12 people, which isn't the full group, but certainly is a large portion of dates that work for folks. And in July, as we kind of expected, the early parts of July are not great. But a date emerged before the 31st, which is Thursday, July 22nd, from 9 to 11 a.m. 11 people can do that time. And we have some August and September dates as well, but just wanted to pause there with July.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So I think, the interest was that we would meet sooner than later. That's about 3 weeks away from here, which gives plenty of time for a survey to go out, for us to get information back, for us to put together a draft agenda, for people to weigh in on that, and for us to have a productive meeting in the third week in July. So, and we can also confirm that by email as well with people, so we don't have to take the time to weigh in on it here. But so in terms of expectations for next steps, we're going to do a meeting summary that we'll send out to you in a week. We'll do the survey about the key questions. The meeting summary will include a lot of what, everything we talked about here today, including, if I had a whiteboard and a chart pack that I could write on in front of you, I've got some things that we can put out for us to organize ourselves around in terms of the focus and the scope. So we'll include that in the survey as well for you to weigh in on and add, wordsmithing. So I think that that's the best course of action at this point for us to keep the momentum moving forward and get some more clarity in order to structure our next meeting and anticipate a meeting in July, hopefully in that third week, but not a field meeting at the end of the month. So I'm just seeing some head nodding, and it is 4:01 and Ernie's signing off. Or are you waving at me because you want to say something, or are you saying goodbye? Yeah, goodbye. Yeah, so that's what you can expect for next steps. I hope that you are all staying cool. I appreciate the level of discourse that you all had with each other today. I think it was a good first start. You can expect a email from us here within, well, not within the week, but in a week.
And that will also contain a revised charter, is that?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. Does that sound good? Some vigorous head nodding? Or at least thumbs up or thumbs? Yeah? Okay. All right. A very hot and weary thumbs up from our Zoom folks today. So do try and stay cool. Thanks for your time today. And of course, you can reach out to Samurai and any of the commissioners in between meetings as well.
Thank you.